lot of information to throw at everybody. So I want to try and squeeze in as much as possible. And if for some reason we don't get to all the questions that might come in, I'm happy to answer questions via email as well. So let's get started here. The first thing I want to just give everybody some information on are some resources. IES organizations and IES committees, for example, as they particularly relate to lighting and low vision. So first, there's the IES Light and Human Health Committee. This is a tremendously talented group of individuals who distill down all the important information about our physiology and the associated impacts of lighting on that physiology. And they have produced a document called TM18, which gives a great baseline of information about lighting and our response to lighting that sort of sets up everything else. So I highly recommend this document as a good sort of base level understanding for any other kind of guidance that you may get. There's really a tremendous amount of wonderful information. Then there is the committee that I am currently the chair of, which is the Lighting for the Aged and Partially Sighted Committee. And so our scope is to monitor and discuss really all issues around older adults or those with low vision, and as it relates to lighting. So we do a lot of evaluation, continuous evaluation of research, published research, case studies, anything that we can find, and sort of that informs our recommended practice that we produce. And the premier document that we produce, if you will, is RP28, which was recently revised this year, even though it's dated 2020, it was actually published this year. And this is our recommended practice, which I know everybody on this call is probably very familiar with, as it has a place in your national energy code as well as it does in ours here in the US. And so it addresses a multitude of factors, from illuminance levels to value contrast, reflectance values, so on and so forth. And it also is a bit of an expansion in scope. I don't know how many people have an idea of the history of the RP28 committee, but we used to be much more focused in scope on residence environments, so particularly the living spaces that people were occupying. That was sort of the original scope of this committee many years ago. And it has expanded every year to the point now that the document name has changed to reflect that we're really encompassing all environments. And it's well beyond residential, so beyond, say, the continuing care community, the multifamily type style of project. We really are trying to expand to really any type of environment that an older adult or those in the low vision population would frequent, which essentially is just about any kind of environment, as we'll talk about a little bit more. So RP28 is a pioneering document in the sense that it was one of the first documents of its type. And it is referenced all over the place, not just in international energy codes, but it is referenced in other recommended practices all around the world, and is a baseline for other documents that are being developed by the CIE and other organizations that talk about this information. So it is broken up into a couple of different categories of information. We have both prescriptive information as well as sort of general recommendations and awareness. You'll find that the prescriptive information targets things such as illuminance levels, value contrast, uniformity ratios, which are sort of the mathematical side of things that where we can get our arms around some particular data or particular points, in which we can say, here you really need to reach, these this sort of criteria. But there is a vast amount of latitude that has to be taken into consideration with things like space planning, color rendering, daylighting, even luminaire appearance and distribution patterns, all of these things which tend to be a little bit more nebulous. And in the document, we try to create a greater awareness around this and make the connections to the things that are more prescriptive to sort of give the practitioner some guidance in applying the information. So we do try to address both things, but you'll find things such as the typical luminance table in this document, where we do go through all types of areas, common areas where we feel like the typical luminance levels and ratios need to be adjusted beyond what the standard is in the handbook, the IES handbook, or now the new lighting library just addresses particular areas. One of the big things that came about, which is addressed in your current National Energy Code, is back in 2013 was the first time that ASHRAE 90.1, which was the basis for most of our local energy codes, state-by-state energy codes here in the National Energy Code. We interfaced with the 90.1 committee in order to deal with the fact that we were asking for higher lighting levels while they were driving power densities to the basement. There's just perpetual push every code cycle, every 3 years, to push power densities lower, lower, lower. And particularly with lighting, which seems to be have a big target on its back, which is a whole, I guess, presentation in and of itself. We can debate the validity of that, but lighting is an easy target, and therefore those levels are getting pushed lower and lower. So how do you rectify that with our desire to see more light? And is the technology of LEDs, for example, keeping pace with that? And so we did not feel like that was the case, and we interfaced with the 90.1 committee in order to get them to recognize this disparity, and they created a separate set of criteria for power densities for environments that cater to the visually impaired. And you will obviously see that in your National Energy Code as well. In fact, your National Energy Code specifically references facilities that are spaces that are designed to meet RP28. 90.1 beats around the bush and doesn't reference 90.8. Doesn't reference RP28, but references facilities that were designed for those with low vision. So it kind of gets at the same thing. And the reason why I bring this up and why it's so important is because what we're asking for, what we're saying is a recommended practice, you really do need to leverage this. It's getting a lot easier with the efficiency and efficacy that we're seeing with LED products. But still, it is helpful to have these additional power densities, which you can see from this chart, and this is from 90.1, is substantially different. I mean, getting in some cases double the amount of watts per square foot or square meter, if you will, is tremendous. And that is a big help in doing this. So the other document, which you may not be familiar with because it was also published this year, but for the first time, is this new consumer guide that our committee published called Lighting Your Way to Better Vision. And so this is less geared to you guys as practitioners and experts in this field, and more geared to your clients. And so this is a document that gives them, uses common language, simplified language that the layperson can understand, and tries to help them get their arms around the subject matter of lighting, low vision, a lot of terminology they may see printed on lamp catalog or boxes when they go to home stores and things like that, and tries to give them some guidance and understanding what all of these things mean to them and their spaces. And it literally goes through a whole design guide of various common living spaces, kitchens, living rooms, bedrooms, those sorts of things, and gives them strategies in which to improve the environment. But it obviously stops short of the highly technical information that is in the RP. The guide is really here as an education resource, both for you to point your clients to, but also for people in general. And we are trying to get the word out and get this information out through various organizations as a sort of education milestone for us as a committee to bring greater awareness to this need. So other than the IES committees, the National Institute of Building Sciences here in the US has a low vision design committee, which was established back in 2011. And this committee is not focused just on lighting. It is focused on the entire facility. So interior design, architecture, HVAC, all of these things, and how they may relate to low vision. Of course, has a lighting section into it, and it is very comprehensive. It does reference RP28 in most of the lighting related information that is in there, but it also has some other good references and information. And it was truly a wonderful group of people that were involved in this project from all different areas of the built environment that made it quite a powerful document. And this is a free document that you can get on the Nibs website. If you just search for the Low Vision Design Committee, you will find this document. I will also say that going back to the CG1, the consumer guide, that is also a free document. And that is on the IES web store. You just need to log into the web store. And if you have an account, you can download a free PDF version of that document. So the Nibs document, this is an image of the cover here. Ultimately, the goal for this document, and this is a committee and organization that moves a bit slow given its size and the way it's structured. The first task, which we have accomplished right now, is to create this guideline. But ultimately, the goal is to push this into a standard and eventually for code adoption. So that obviously relates to the US, but there is a big push both for RP28 as well as this to try and codify it in many ways. And RP28 is getting referenced in a lot of other standards, such as the FGI guidelines for healthcare facilities. And there are many states in the US that comply with the FGI guidelines, and de facto then those organizations have to comply with RP28. So slowly we're finding our way into codifying this document.
Hi, Greg. Just one question before we
yes.
move on. There's one question in the chat about if there's access available to printed copies of the CG1.
Yeah, so the IES no longer prints documents of any kind, I believe. Everything is electronic. So you would have to download a PDF and print it yourself. That is the only way to get a printed copy these days. Our committee did get a grant at one point to get some printed copies to send them to municipalities and certain other organizations. I don't know if we have any extra copies left, but it is electronic only through the IES. Okay, so those are your basic resources between the IES committees, the RP28 and the TM18 committee, as well as the Nibs committee, producing information for lighting for low vision, as well as other aspects of design as it relates to the Nibs committee. And it's a great wealth of information. So how you process all of that information, you really need this baseline of understanding of the aging eye and the visual system, eye diseases and visual function, in order to really be able to get your arms around this information and apply it. So as practitioners, we solve problems. We are hired by clients in order to solve some kind of problem for them. And in order to solve a problem, we have to be able to understand that problem, define that problem. So how do we define low vision? Well, low vision is technically defined by a visual acuity of 20/70 in the better eye with correction, being glasses or surgery. And blindness is considered a visual acuity of 20/200 in the better eye with correction. But as practitioners, what does that really even tell us? We need a little bit more information than that. So let's back up for a second. I'm sure everybody is well aware at this point, and this light and health has been a very popular topic for the last 10 years or so, that this bell curve of the population is expanding toward the top, right? So our older population is getting larger and larger and larger because everybody is living longer, healthier lives. That means that we have a greater older population that are more likely going to be living with some kind of vision issue. Here in the US, the statistics are pretty striking. The single largest age group is the 80 plus age group by 2050, 2060. That is going to be the single largest age group that we have. And that speaks volumes for who we need to be designing for. We're also expected by the mid-2030s to have a greater over 65 population than children under 18. This is going to be the first time that this has happened. And that, again, is giving us some sense of who this population is that we're designing for. So we know that the population is getting older. And if the population is getting older, then we are going to be dealing with more and more natural age-related issues for vision. And what are those issues? Well, some of those most common ones are a reduction in retinal photoreceptors. So we tend to lose quantities of our rods as we get older. And we know that rods are associated with low light vision. Our lens tends to harden, which results in presbyopia. So that's nearsightedness, farsightedness. Our lens tends to yellow, opacification. So this is like putting on a pair of yellow sunglasses, if you will. And this starts to make connections into our circadian impacts. Our pupil gets smaller, so our pupils are not able to dilate to the same dynamic range as they were when we're younger. So we're physically not able to dilate our eyes as much to get as much light into our eyes. We have greater instances of floaters, which are these vitreous clumps in our eyes. Often you can see them when you look into a bright light like car headlights, right? In the peripheral vision, you'll see these things sort of floating around in your peripheral vision. Those are these floaters. And our dark adaptation slows. So our dark adaptation, both in its dynamic range and its speed, changes. Being able to get from one end of that range to the other is dramatically slower, but the entirety of that range is more narrow. So we never, as we get older, are able to adjust to low light levels to the same degree as, say, someone in their mid-20s, if you will, versus someone who is in their mid-60s. So those are something that, all of these things are things that every one of us will have to deal with to some degree, right? All of them to different degrees, but we will deal with all of these things. And then you layer on top of that disease-related issues that become more apparent as we get older. Everything from cataracts, glaucoma, retinal detachment, AMD, diabetic retinopathy, retinitis pigmentosa. All of these things have tremendous impacts on our vision. And I'll note that things like AMD, age-related macular degeneration, doesn't really have a cure, and is becoming more and more prevalent. Diabetic retinopathy too. Diabetes is exploding all over the world, and this is one of the impacts of that. So all of these things, both the disease-related elements and the non-disease related elements, conspire to do a few things. The first is that they physically reduce the amount of light entering the eye. So more light is required. They increase the amount of light that is scattered in the eye. Things like those vitreous clumps, the floaters that I was talking about, impact the amount of light that is scattered in the eye, which creates a greater susceptibility to glare, both direct and reflective. And then there's the reduction of the blue wavelengths of light that enter our visual system. And this is where our connection is to our circadian rhythm, where that can become compromised. That's particularly related to that opacification that I had mentioned, where we're getting a yellowing of the lens. So looking at those age-related issues, the natural ones, and the disease-related issues, and distilling them down to these 3 points. I mean, this is obviously a vastly more complex subject matter, but as practitioners, distilling this conversation down to these 3 elements gives us something that we can get our arms around and actually apply in our practices to environments, because these are 3 tangible things that we can actually impact. So looking at these 3 elements, we're going to touch on, say, light and health first, the visual and non-visual. One of the important things to realize is that these 3 impacts impact us in different ways, both physiologically and psychologically. One of the things that a lot of owners, building owners and facility owners, are most acutely aware of are trips and falls. Because those are tremendously impactful to the amount of care that they have to give, as well as insurance costs and other things. And when you look at the numbers, and I ran this for the US through the CDC here, you see that unintentional falls are by and far the largest cause of non-fatal emergency room visits in the US. Nearly 30% of all the overall injuries are from unintentional falls. And that is a tremendous percentage. Unintentional injuries next in line there are far and away much lower percentage than unintentional falls. So you start to see how something physical, just as a fall, because of someone's vision, can be so impactful to an environment. But there are other things like that aren't as advertised as much, such as being able to simply read medicine labels, being able to see what it is you're reaching for to take, being able to read the instructions from a doctor, being able to see the labels on a shelf when you're purchasing healthcare products for yourself, or any products for that matter. What about being able to read egress signage? This is something that nobody ever talks about, but we think about this in the RP28 committee, because if you look at the picture on the right, this is very common in the US here. In a lot of buildings, you find this in stairwells and lobbies, and you look at all this signage, and it's kind of, all right, you understand it, you see it, you can decipher it, but there's a lot of information there. And when we do think about this, we often don't think about this in the context of the environment when somebody really does need to read these. So what about when there is panic, when there's smoke, when there's fire, when alarm bells are going off? And then you have somebody who is complicating the situation because they have low vision, and they need to stand 2 feet from the sign in order to read all of it and understand this information. And it becomes very, very difficult. Then there's also the psychological effects. The perception of the quality of life has a huge impact on care demands. People say 75% of people say their biggest concern is vision loss, because they equate vision loss with their independence. And in losing your independence is one of the most frightening things for the average person. It's the top of their list of health fears. So you couple that with things like impaired concentration and learning, pain perception, decreased productivity, all this leading to potential depression. All this distills down to the quality of life that somebody has. And when you lower somebody's quality of life, you increase their care demands. Whether you're talking about a continuing care facility where they have active care for people, or even in the independent living situations, care demands increase, and that has a bottom dollar impact. Then you look at the physiological effects, and here we start getting into circadian stimulus. And I'm not going to get into a super amount of detail in this presentation about this because I'm sure you have had many presentations about this. So we know that lighting impacts our circadian rhythm, and that our circadian rhythm is responsible for over 100-time body functions, from blood pressure to hormone secretion and to sleep. So this is hugely impactful, and it is driving a tremendous advancement in lighting fixture and LED technology. So what does this really mean to us? Well, having a fragmented circadian cycle, when you look at it, so the image on the left here, you'll see that on the top, you have a typical cycle of a good and trained circadian cycle where you've got the peaks and valleys here. So I don't know if you can see my cursor, but it's like a sine wave, where the peaks here you have are during the daytime when somebody is awake, and the valleys are when somebody should be asleep. And when you look at the level below that, it's labeled as old, that shows a fragmented cycle where you start to lose the definition between the sleep and awake time because the body can't discern between the two. And if you drill down to look at that sleep time, you can see that the younger person, again, within that sleep period, has a nice defined sine wave, right? There are defined peaks and valleys where they're getting into the lower levels of REM sleep. But when you look at the older person's sleep period, you see that, one, they never really get deep into the REM sleep cycle, but their sine wave is much more compressed. They have many more peaks and valleys, which means that they're bouncing in and out of the deeper sleep all the way to the awake cycle much more frequently, which creates a disruptive sleep pattern. And we can all remember back to when we were, say, in university, and we would stay up all night to write a paper or whatever it was, and what that did to us, the next day or after a few days of not having much sleep, what that does to your cognitive abilities. It has a huge impact. And there have been a number of studies on this, that a circadian disruption or fragmented cycle can result in poor sleep, higher stress, increased anxiety, depression, smoking, cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, and even higher instances of breast and prostate cancer, of which I will point out that the two studies for breast and prostate cancer were enough to stimulate the World Health Organization to label shift work as a probable carcinogen. So this lends a lot of weight to the impacts that we're having when we have disrupted or fragmented circadian cycles. Additionally, we see changes in cortisol levels, which tend to equate to depressive symptoms when we have a fragmented cycle. We see that our memory and mental speed and executive functions start to deteriorate when we have these fragmented cycles. Our cognitive performance takes a huge hit. We also start to see that we have memory deficits. This was a study that was done where they MRI'd people's brain activity after they had a fragmented sleep cycle, and they started to see that there was much less activation in particular parts of the brain when people had a disrupted cycle. And we're starting to see that there are medial temporal lobe atrophy correlations with fragmented cycle, which is really terrifying, because now we're talking about our explicit memory that is being impacted from fragmented circadian cycles. All of these are hugely impactful elements. So now that everybody is thoroughly depressed about the one thing we can't prevent, which is getting older, right? We can never get back that time. There is some hope, and we do have some power as practitioners. I don't know how familiar you might be with this study, but this was a groundbreaking study that was published back in 2008 and done in the Netherlands, where this was an intervention that was made in a group care facility, where essentially they worked in the common areas where people would spend the vast majority of their time during the day. And they did some lighting interventions, very basic lighting interventions. So they increased the light levels from roughly 300 lux to 1,000 lux. And they changed the color temperature from what was roughly around 2,700 K up to 4,000 K. So they ended up changing the spectral distribution a little bit. They normalized melatonin by giving everybody the same amount of melatonin 1 hour before bedtime, so they could assess the impact that just the lighting intervention was to be had. And so they did some short-term as well as some long-term assessments. And the long-term assessments going out to 3.5 years at the time of the publishing was tremendous. They saw some really notable changes, some improvements. Restlessness at night was reduced over 9%. Sleep onset latency, so how easy it was for somebody to fall asleep, was improved by 19%. Sleep duration increased by 6%. Cognitive deterioration reduced by 5%. Depressive symptoms dropped by 19%. Functional deterioration was reduced by 53%, and aggressive behavior was reduced by 9%. Some of these percentages may seem moderate or small, but you have to understand that this is all happening together. So you're layering on all of these improvements. You're getting all of these percentage improvements across the board, has a tremendous impact on somebody's quality of life. The big one, though, is functional deterioration of dementia patients. 53%. That was similar to the improvements that we see with the standard dementia and Alzheimer's drug regimes that people are on currently. So we were able to see an improvement just with the change of lighting, a modest change of lighting that was similar to the improvements we see with medical intervention with drugs. That really says something. So what does this translate to as a design guide, if you will, for our opportunities as practitioners when trying to distill this out and how we can apply this information? Well, there are certainly lighting things that we can do. And I don't necessarily recommend this. We're not just talking about this kind of light therapy, if you will, but we are talking about something that is far more broad, something that is more encompassing, something that is more integrated, and something that goes beyond lighting. I can't emphasize enough that this is a conversation for the whole design team, because there are elements within the design of a facility that impact lighting that are outside of the lighting designer's control. We're talking about interior design, interior architecture, daylighting elements, so glazing and fenestrations and building orientation. All of these things need to be wrapped up into the conversation. So we look at quantity and quality. We want to think about circadian responsiveness, luminance contrast, value contrast, how to deal with shadows, adaptation, consistency in our application of lighting, and a responsive design. All of this taken together is what I would call an integrated design. So from a circadian standpoint, we're looking to mimic the natural environment. Cool, bright light during the day, and a warm, lower level in the evening. There are a multitude of factors that impact our circadian response to lighting. It is a 5-legged stool. It requires quantity, spectrum, timing, duration, and spatial distribution in order to predict the impact. This is complicated. This is not a quick and easy thing in order to predict, which makes it difficult for the practitioner to sit down and design a system and say, okay, how do I define things like timing and duration and even spatial distribution, because everybody's experience with the space, the user's experience with the space is going to be different from one person to another from day to day. So that becomes a very bit of a moving target on top of the moving target that everybody's vision is different, and their experience is going to be different with things like glare and light levels and all of that. So this is a very complicated topic that we're still wrapping our brains around and will for some time. But that doesn't mean that we can't make simple interventions with, again, circadian optimized lighting, being able to at least stack the cards in our favor. And by that, I mean at least addressing having the right spectral power distributions in the fixtures that we're specifying. So we want as broad of a spectral power distribution as we can get in the fixture, and being able to have the right controls and fixtures to be able to change that spectral power distribution according to the time of day. This can at least help us do some quality intervention. This is an example of just some simple interventions that were done at a continuing care community, where you see that we're talking about a handful of general room lighting fixtures that were made to change their SPD based on the time of day. So in the evening, they can make them warmer and of course lower the intensity. And during the day, they can match it to more of the daylight that is coming in from the windows and increase the blue light content, if you will, as well as the light levels. So very, very simple introduction of that. This is a facility where they did a great write-up. So the U.S. Department of Energy and Pacific Northwest Labs did a study of this AAC Care Center, which is in Sacramento, California. And the study is really very informative. You can find this online if you do a simple Google search for this. It's a free copy of the study that I recommend that you download and you read for your own edification of some of the findings that they had, which were very informative. And they did this, again, very basic intervention where they looked at predominantly the common areas, both for the residents of this facility, but also for the staff of this facility, because again, these facilities are staffed 24/7. So you're talking about the impacts of shift work on the employees, which can be pretty tremendous. And so as you can see, again, they did the same kind of intervention where they were able to change the color temperature and the spectral power distribution over the course of the day, as well as the intensity of the light. And it proved to be a very effective intervention. So going beyond circadian, one of the important things we need to take into consideration for people that low vision is glare. Glare is tremendous, has a tremendous impact. So luminance contrast has to be looked at, whether it is from lighting fixtures or it is from daylight. Glare is something that is very easy for someone to be overcome by when they have low vision, particularly if they have a compounding disease-related issue such as cataracts or something like that. Glare can go from being a minor nuisance to being completely debilitating in a very, very small scale. At the normal sighted person who is, say, middle age, we'll call them sort of in their 50s or so, tends to have a greater range where you go through the uncomfortableness, the disability glare, and then you have a range where you can get to before you get to the disability glare. People with low vision don't have that dynamic range. They go from being a little bit uncomfortable to being completely blinded by glare very, very quickly. So part and parcel with that is value contrast of the surfaces we're working with. And this is why I'm talking about this being a conversation with other designers in projects. You have to look at everything from walls and ceilings to floors. And this includes even outside when you're talking about pathways, where you could have new concrete pathways that are very reflective and during the day can be utterly blinding to someone that has low vision or some kind of vision impairment. Now, creating contrast, of course, with these surfaces is good to delineate pathways, be it contrast of wall surfaces or contrast of floor, or where floor meets wall. And those things are very good to think about and great ways of creating differentiations. But we have to be very careful about the possibility of glare if our reflectance values are too great. Going along with glare is a problem that we see very often that most people don't recognize, normal-sighted people don't recognize as being a problem, are shadows. And we often don't think about this. We think about the glare before we often think about shadows. And it could be strong shadows from mullions in windows or artwork. And the image on the left and right here is the same facility, obviously, but you may not notice from the image on the right, but that wall that's on the left-hand side of this room has got artwork on it. There's a sort of this decoration on it that creates this intense pattern of shadows that you see in the left-hand image there during certain times of the day when the sun is coming from that vantage point. Strong shadows for someone with low vision can fool somebody into thinking that there are level changes. This is one of the number one reasons why people fall when there is no level change. They are interpreting these shadows as objects that are different distances from each other. Therefore, there could be a step there. Or maybe there is an object there that we have to walk around, and it creates a misstep where they then fall where there is nothing to fall over or fall around. And it is a growing problem that we're seeing and very often misunderstood or overlooked. So things to consider for both value contrast and to mitigate glare in general, using low reflectance materials. Not too low that we are not getting the benefit of good light levels in the space, but using ones that are not too reflective, particularly not glossy surfaces. So keep finishes, say, that are adjacent to windows, the ones that are light colored in order to reflect light in the room. But then as you get deeper into a room, being very conscious about having too reflective of a material. Provide control for daylight. Provide control for light fixtures themselves. Being able to change that composition of artificial light and daylight according to the time of day and what is needed for that environment is very important. The room composition too is very important outside the scope of most lighting designers. But again, this is why we circle around to this being a design team conversation, if you will. Lighting the task from the side, being able to provide, and the task could be many things. It could just be a walking surface. It could be a countertop. Lighting the task from more than one angle is an important way of being able to get rid of shadow as well as mitigating glare and that sort of thing. So these are among many strategic ways we can help mitigate those things. One of the other things we want to think about are transition zones. So I talked about earlier that our adaptation range is severely impacted as we get older. So it is much harder to adapt from that bright zone to that dark zone because it's slower as we get older, but that dynamic range is dramatically reduced. So providing transition zones, be it vestibules, or if there is no vestibule, being able to provide a zone from the exterior door to some point inside where during the day you can provide a lot more light just on the inside of that exterior door and provide a gradual transition to the standard interior light levels is tremendously helpful. And the true is in reverse too, as well, when people are exiting. Consistent lighting for circulations. Our eye adjusts to the brightest spot. And when somebody has vision loss or vision problems, you can throw off their perception of detail and obstacles because their eyes are adjusting to some brighter spot in a space that is creating a greater disparity for the darker areas because of their vision loss. This corridor, for example, on this image, right? Looks reasonable maybe, but you see how there's literally a dark spot at nearly every threshold. And because you have these spikes of light, our eyes are naturally going to adjust to those brighter points and make those thresholds look a lot darker. Something that we can do is try to be more consistent with that lighting and create visual interest and contrast through surface finishes and colors. Now, obviously, how we apply that is going to be in different gradations based on the facility. A nursing care facility is going to have a greater degree of care that you're going to need to apply than, say, just a continuing care facility where it's independent living versus, say, a standard facility, be it a multifamily apartment or condo building, or even a hospitality environment, right? So, what you're seeing in the picture is not necessarily very sexy for a hospitality environment, but the point gets across that, your level or gradation of consistency in the lighting needs to be balanced with delineating boundaries and highlighting destinations and surfaces with finish colors and textures. So there's a fine balance there. So where people need more help, which want to be more consistent with the light levels and the distribution of light, and use more of the finish colors and surfaces to delineate those boundaries. Something I want to make sure that I make a point of bringing up is emergency lighting. This is something that is very important to the RP28 committee that we really find very difficult to make headway with. Here in the US, or National Fire Protection Association, FPA, publishes their 101 document, and the international building codes generally define the minimum light levels for egress lighting as 1 foot candles. NFPA defines it as an average of 1 foot candle. I believe the IBC defines it as a minimum of 1 foot candle, but I will tell you that everybody in our committee and the Nibs committee and that look at low vision lighting can tell you that 1 foot candle is not enough. And there's no reason for it. And we are actively petitioning and trying to get organizations like the NFPA and the ICC to increase the requirements for egress lighting, minimum egress lighting in facilities, because it is just not enough and not necessary with LED fixtures that we have out there. Battery backups, and which was the original genesis for the 1 foot candle requirement, can power the LED emergency fixtures for far longer than they could power fluorescent and incandescent fixtures when the standards were first introduced. So we can afford to be able to give people greater light levels during emergency situations. So all of this taken into consideration, thinking about circadian optimization, multi-layered artificial lighting, working and daylighting into that, putting all the proper controls to be able to take all of those things and coordinate all of them creates this tunable lighting environment, as I like to call it, that is absolutely critical for any environment where you're applying RP28. So if you're applying RP28, then you should be looking at that tunable lighting environment. So that is the end of my presentation. I wanted to leave here, hopefully just 5 or 6 minutes for any questions. If you have questions, I know it was a mad dash to the end there, and I threw a lot of information at you guys. But I just wanted to give you at least some idea of being able to get your arms around both the resources that are out there and the things that we as committee members on the IES committee, as well as other committees, are looking at in the totality of the environment in order to create these recommendations and help practitioners like myself and like you get our arms around this intensely complicated subject matter to be able to apply practical real world applications, right? Because we have to deal with a lot of things like, say, money, budget, that we wouldn't, that don't necessarily play nice into being able to optimize every environment. So with that recognition, hopefully you'll be able to get your arms around the information enough to be able to apply what is the most impactful for your particular environment, and including the other practitioners, interior designers and architects, be able to spread the responsibility around to be able to help the visual environment and improve your lighting through surface finishes and even space planning and all of that. So if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to address any questions. You can put it in the chat, or I guess you can just turn on your mic and ask a question, but I am happy to address anything.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. That was a great presentation. A lot of really awesome information there. I haven't seen any other questions come through in the chat, but yeah, everyone feel free to send questions along or unmute and ask Greg anything.
I mean, I can talk about this subject for forever, and I can continue to elaborate that. You know, I find the challenge as a lighting designer, as a practitioner in this subject matter, is finding the right nexus based on the project type. You have different groups of people and different types of facilities and different budgets and interests and owners. Marrying that all together, it can be a little bit of a challenge. Okay, so let's see here. Regarding textures, are there some that are better suited than others that don't cause tripping hazards or other issues? Okay, that's a great question. I'll address that sort of two sides. So when looking at finishes, I will say that yes, the least busy of a finish is the better finish. So patterns are tremendously detrimental to somebody with low vision. Patterns are terrible. So you don't want a very patterned carpet. You find this in hotels all the time with these crazy patterned carpets, and sometimes they'll even carpet, you know, the tread and riser of a stair, for example, on the same carpet. So somebody with low vision stepping down can't see the difference because of the pattern and the similarity between one step and the next. So patterns are really problematic. So we generally recommend, you know, solid colors and very, very simple patterns. Textures, that I can't really speak to whether it's plush or it's not. I mean, something like that can induce tripping from a physical standpoint. But you want to be careful of patterns. And as far as colors, as far as reflectance values, you want something that's in the medium range. You don't want something terribly dark, but you know, it's very difficult to have a very bright color on there as well. And I also am an advocate of making distinctions about where walking surfaces meet other surfaces like walls and stuff, to have differences in colors or transition zones of different colors to delineate that. Somebody's got their hand up here. Roby, did you want to ask a question?
Hi.
Sorry if I didn't pronounce that right.
It is, you got it right, Roby. So I'm really new to the lighting industry, and you started to speak about the nexus of professionals and stakeholders involved in order to make a change or an effect towards health using lighting design. In your experience, like how is this brought to the table? Because in a lot of the builds that I've been involved with in the past, not necessarily in the lighting industry, the customers, the homeowners, the clients don't know what they don't know. And even the stakeholders like the designers and the architects, we hesitate to bring this up because it starts to bring a level of complexity and cost that may not be welcome to the table, especially if you're dealing with a commercial development where anything that could incur cost gets basically poo-pooed on.
Yes.
So what has your experience been, and how do you foresee a way to bring more of this information to the table? Or
right.
I hope I'm posing the question properly.
No, yeah, no, you are. And so I will say that first, I have had varying levels of success myself that range from no success to a lot of success. So it's all over the board. But as a workflow for you to be able to have this conversation, what I like to do is if an end user is involved, a document like the consumer guide is a great document to say, here's some information about a subject matter related to my profession that I think you should know for this project. And just passing that along to them to sort of open the gateway, if you will, to that conversation is very helpful. Around the table of practitioners, at the beginning of a project, it's important to broach the subject matter with everybody as a point of how important it is for the specific population that this facility is geared to. It's going to be hard for people to dismiss this subject matter if you're working on a continuing care community. If you're working on a hotel, it's a little bit harder of a sell, right? Because the primary population is not necessarily those. But either way, it's a topic that I usually bring up, and I usually try to provide a copy or excerpts from things like RP28, even TM18 to the engineers and the architects that are involved. And sometimes I even offer to provide the team a 15, 20-minute presentation on the subject, saying this is a really important topic that I think is important for all of us. During our next group meeting, I would like to, 15, 20 minutes to present this information, and I try to boil it all down to just a handful of slides that identify the problem. You want to, say the problem statement and what you think are the solutions and why it relates to the population of the project. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of work for the lighting designer, for that practitioner. But if you have a good group of people, and again, as the stakes get higher based on the type of facility and those occupants' needs, I find that most practitioners are receptive to at least having that initial conversation about what they feel like is the importance of this subject matter. And I think that's an important distinction. You don't want to come off as being, too high and mighty about the subject matter because it's a team effort. And I usually like to start the conversation by saying, this is an important subject to me. I'm curious what, Mr. Engineer, Mr. Architect, Mr. Interior Designer, what is your take on this subject matter and how it impacts our project as sort of an icebreaker for the conversation. And then from there, you could go into offering to give a short presentation and providing them some excerpts from these documents and that sort of thing. So that answer your question, I hope.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Okay, a couple of the things in the chat here. The major study that you referenced changed both light level and color temperature. Are there studies we can review that change only one to better understand the impact of each? I wish there was more information that was studies about actual facilities that distilled it down to that level of granularity. This is we have a case study and evidence-based research subcommittee in our RP28 larger committee that research these kinds of things. And there is some information out there. Lighting Research Center at Rensselaer Polytechnic has a number of studies that I think you might be able to locate on their website in regard to your question. Pacific Northwest Labs does have some stuff in there, but you're probably going to find more specific targeted information from an organization like the Lighting Research Center, because they do look at some specific things like that. Some of the acknowledgements and references in RP28, I don't know them obviously off the top of my head, but if you look at those references and look at some of those studies, you'll start to find some of the information that you're looking for. But it is by and large one of the subject areas of getting more case studies and research done that we're looking to try and support, if you will. Okay, I saw the original Netherlands study released from 2008, and although the results appear to be overwhelming, change really does need to be driven by legislation to be impactful. 100% there. Do you see changes coming at the legislative level? Well, short answer is yes. But good grief, I'm certainly not going to be in this business long enough to see the type of change that you're certainly hoping for, and I'm certainly hoping for, because it works at a snail's pace, and too much of this is politicized. It's painful. I will tell you that the RP28 committee, since it has the most robust infrastructure for trying to standardize, or I'm sorry, to try and get the recommended practice into other people's references in order to try and codify it. We're trying to sort of go about this from that direction and getting other organizations such as the FGI, Facilities Guidelines Institute, to take the RP and reference it as a requirement. And through that method, we're actually seeing progress. States like Florida and Washington State are two examples where they are required for certain facilities, such as skilled nursing facilities, to comply with RP28. And it is growing. The list is growing for states and municipalities that are requiring RP28 by virtue of some other standard. That's the route that we're going. For example, the National Institute of Building Sciences is not taking that route, and they're trying to interface with the Access Board that is the genesis of our ADA code, and trying to get that, push that into possibly the ADA code as being, a part of the American Disabilities Act, which would be tremendous, because that would make it, a civil right here in the U.S. But that, as you can imagine, that process is fraught with tremendous pitfalls and complexities that I can't even wrap my head around. So it's going to take a long time, but the process of getting it accepted by other organizations that already have codification of their documents, I think is the way to go. That's the best I can give on sort of that subject matter. We are also interfacing with Prevent Blindness, if you're familiar with that organization, and the Center for Vision Health, and a couple other organizations, some of which have not just a national, but also an international footprint. And we are interfacing with them on two levels. One, education of their clientele. So if we can educate the end user, so the end user demands that they have better environments, which will then trickle, up to us when the clients ask us to design these environments. And we're also interfacing with them to access their resources to municipalities and politicians, and through that route as well. It's an immense effort for a volunteer organization, and we're perpetually exhausted every time. Our outreach committee is the hardest working subset within the RP28 committee. They never sleep because we're constantly pushing this from all these different levels. So hopefully that answers your question. I would say that, the more you guys can educate your clients and other organizations and talk about this as being an important subject matter at design meetings, just as Roby's question addressed, the better off I think we'll all be, because it'll be less esoteric information, right? Everybody will have heard of it, and everybody will start to agree, okay, that's important. Another thing that I think is important to do is push the industry, and by the industry I mean the manufacturing industry, to start incorporating the higher quality and the ability to have, say, circadian optimized lighting in more of the fixture lines. The better the lighting products are, and the more variety we have in that regard, the more of them that encompass that technology, the more the cost will be driven down and the more appealing it will be to a lot of clients, because a lot of decisions are cost driven. I have a client that I consult with, a continuing care client that is a national developer, and they continue to ask me to do evaluations for them on the costs of different interventions, and they were inching closer and closer to it. But what's preventing them from redesigning all their facilities is basically cost. But as the cost goes down for products, they are willing to take some of that additional cost on and increase the effectiveness or on the ability of their lighting systems to incorporate things like circadian-based lighting. Even just simply having the controls to be able to change the intensity and the color temperature of a light in a space, right, has a cost impact. But adding those little by little to their projects, because the costs are getting a little more feasible for them, helps push the cost down overall for the industry, but helps them get their feet wet and tolerate those increases in costs. And so coming at it from both those sides is really important. I know that as a practitioner, I'm always looking for those products that provide that at a cost competitive rate. And having the technology and the control side of those lighting fixtures, so the fixtures can talk well between manufacturers on the same lighting control system, is another thing that we need to have a little more advancement with in the manufacturing side. We need to be able to have fixtures from different manufacturers on the same control protocols, be able to change color temperatures and transition in the same manner in a space. It's possible to do. There just needs to be that impetus to do that. Often a chicken and egg conversation. Is the demand there, versus, are the prices where they are need to be in order to increase that demand. That's a difficult thing to do, but I always talk about it with manufacturers because I try to specify it wherever possible in any facility. Even in facilities that are not designed for low vision, I do some hospitality work. I sell this concept to hotels and hospitality owners all the time, that they want this kind of lighting, that this has added value to their facility to be able to market to their clients. Just like LEED at one time was very esoteric, and now building owners want LEED because they can market it to prospective customers and clients as their facility being green and healthy. Well building is now gaining traction because developers and owners are seeing that, people want a healthy environment. I can advertise my building as being a healthy environment. So there's a bottom dollar advantage to that. They can increase, rates of, for whatever it is, rents or, the rates for rooms at hotels and offices and whatnot. So that is a benefit to everybody. All right. Anything else? I know we're almost 15 minutes over here.
Yeah, thanks for a great discussion here and some awesome ending thoughts there. Lots of things interconnected to the whole conversation. Lots of things to think about and take to our own projects. I don't see any other questions in the chat. So yeah, thank you everyone for attending today. And thank you for your donations to the Alberta Society for the Visually Impaired here in Edmonton. Greg, all of the attendees here were by donation to that organization here in Alberta. So a nice little Christmas gift for them.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and
I will also say that if anybody, you're welcome to give anybody my contact information. So if anybody has any further questions that they come up with, later tonight or next week or something, they have an epiphany that they have a question, they're more than welcome to reach out to me. And I will also say that we are very receptive to feedback on the recommended practice on RP28 as well as CG1. So if you experience anything in your practice as you try to use that information, reach out to me and let me know. If you have a problem with something, a light level is too low, too high, contrast ratio doesn't seem right, whatever it is, give me the context, send me the information, reach out to me, and I will bring it to the committee and we will assess it. And it's things like that that impact our documents the most, when we get real world feedback from practitioners and what they're seeing from their own design. So please do keep in touch.
Perfect. And I've just put Greg's contact information in the chat there. And I see there's a question if the presentation will be available at a later date. We have recorded the presentation, but Greg, is it available to send out if anyone wants to have it?
Yeah, absolutely. I can email that to you and then you can distribute that as needed.
Perfect. Sounds good. So just one quick announcement before we pop off here relating to the IES. So this was our last event for the year for the Edmonton section. So please stay tuned in January for some upcoming events, some more technical ones. We have lots of more events upcoming. And we'll also have local and national illumination awards starting up in the new year. So start thinking about any projects that you want to submit for those. And thanks again for attending, and thank you once more, Greg. I hope everyone has a great holiday season.
Likewise, thank you. It's my pleasure.
Thanks. Bye, everybody.